here is a problem. This is what you call a proof by contradiction. Premise number 1. According to the Quran, Dhul Qarnayn is a righteous believer, almost a prophet of Allah even, praised mightily as God's servant. Premise number 2. We know Dhul Qarnayn is Alexander the Great. Premise number 3. We now know that Alex is a pagan, maybe even a homosexual, although evidence is not as strong about this. But he definitely was not a monotheist, neither a Christian, Jew, nor a Muslim. He was an idol worshipper, a pagan. Therefore, the Quran is wrong. Done. Checkmate. It's over. In one fell swoop, the Quran is debunked. You don't need any other arguments. History and architecture debunks the Quran, and it's called a proof by contradiction. But what's the evidence that Dhul Qarnayn is Alex? This was provided by the scholar Wallace Budge in 1896. A large amount of similarities between the stories indicates that the two either share a common source or that the Quran is copied from the Alexander Syriac romance. Additional evidence to this fact is that when the Quran speaks about this, it says they ask you about Dhul Qarnayn. So this is not some unknown entity. He was known. Not to mention, Dhul Qarnayn means two horns, which Alex is known as possessing. Then there's recent archaeological discoveries that give even more evidence to this claim. Professor Sean Anthony of Ohio State University, Department of Near Eastern Languages and Cultures, wrote about the recent discovery. The excavations done at an early Byzantine site within the Akrotiri Peninsula on Cyprus discovered a 7th century martyrium containing what's being called Alexander Heraclius' stele. It's significant for all sorts of reasons. The takeaway is obvious. The identification of the Quranic Dhul Qarnayn with Alexander is supported by well-attested iconography of Alexander with two horns. A contemporary literary text with numerous textual parallels. So basically he's talking about how the two stories are very, very similar. The early literary reception of the Alexander legends in Arabic, which makes this identification, and now 7th century Byzantine iconography of Alexander with two horns that is contemporary with the Quran. So this is from the 7th century. If you want to come up with a different theory that Dhul Qarnayn is not Alexander the Great but is Cyrus the Great, good luck. You're going to have to find a way to get rid of this wealth of evidence that's against you. As Professor Anthony replied on Twitter, it's an open and shut case and has been for quite a while. I feel like I spent too much time discussing Dhul Qarnayn. In reality, I spent weeks researching this when I was in a doubting phase. Dhul Qarnayn really undoes Islam like no other topic. And we didn't even talk about the sun going into a murky pool yet. Then, of course, the famous translator of the Quran, Yusuf Ali, also says similarly. He says he used to lecture in Greek history and even studied him in great depth, visited the localities connected with his career, and the connection is undeniable. There is still more that I want to respond to.
Yusuf Ali, the famous translator of the Quran, who studied Greek literature, believes that there is no doubt that Dhul Qarnayn can be no other than Alexander the Great. In his appendix he describes this man in great detail, which I have included here for your perusal. I learned about the story about the Quran's account of Dhul Qarnayn. As part of my research into the Quran, this was one of the biggest problems I ran into. The story of Dhul Qarnayn has so many issues. I spent days reading everything I could find on this topic until I came to the conclusion that this story is not from God. At the end of this post I have links for further reading as there is a lot more detail than I put here. FD. The story of Dhul Qarnayn is a fantastical story of a man who traveled to the east and west, and trapped the nation of Gog and Magog between mountains. Was Dhul Qarnayn Alexander the Great? There is lots of evidence that he was due to the startling similarity of the stories as well as the common folklore about Alexander. Even if he wasn't, there are many other issues with the actual content of this story that need to be addressed. For example, there are their issues. Issue number 1 is that Dhul Qarnayn went to the place of the rising of the sun and the setting of the sun. Issue number 2 is that Dhul Qarnayn trapped a people behind two mountains using a dam or gate of copper and iron. Issue number 3 is that these people are constantly digging from this trapped location until Allah allows them to escape and they will wreak havoc on humanity. Could it be an analogy? The Quran has many stories in it. In fact, one of the claims of its miraculous nature is that it contains many stories that Prophet Muhammad could not have known. It is said that God himself told him these stories. For example, Quran chapter 3 verse 44 states the following, quote, "That is from the news of the unseen which we reveal to you, O Muhammad." and you were not with them when they cast their pens as to which of them should be responsible for Mary. Nor were you with them when they disputed. Close quote. Also Quran chapter 18 verse 13 states the following, quote, "It is we who relate to you, O Muhammad, their story and truth." Close quote. Also Quran chapter 11 verse 120 states the following, quote, "And each story we relate to you from the news of the messengers is that by which we make firm your heart. And there has come to you, in this, the truth and an instruction and a reminder for the believers." Close quote. Also Quran chapter 18 verse 99 states the following, quote, "And we will leave them that day surging over each other, and, then, the horn will be blown, and we will assemble them in, one, assembly." Close quote. From these verses of the Quran, it makes it crystal clear in these verses that it is not the case that the story of Dhul Qarnayn is an analogy. The question becomes, is Dhul Qarnayn Alexander the Great? Yusuf Ali, the famous translator of the Quran, who studied Greek literature, believes that there is no doubt that Dhul Qarnayn can be no other than Alexander the Great. In his appendix he describes this man in great detail, which I have included here for your perusal. For the longest time, classical scholars said that Dhul Qarnayn was Alexander the Great. Many early tafsir make this claim as well, Fakhr al-Din al-Razi, Tafsir al-Jalalain for example. Also there are references to Dhul Qarnayn being in pre-Islamic poetry found in Ibn Ishaq's Siyara. At this point in time, early Islamic history, there was no problem in making this connection, because it was not known that Alexander the Great was a pagan polytheist. Only recently due to the discovery of historic documents, as compared to the romantic or fantastical stories of Alexander, we now know that Alexander the Great was a pagan and he was not a monotheist. This means that due to new historic evidence, Dhul Qarnayn cannot be Alexander the Great, or otherwise the Quran would be wrong, or history is wrong. This is why most modern Muslim scholars like Dr. Yasir Qadhi now want to say that Dhul Qarnayn was not Alexander the Great. Also, Islamic scholar Abul Alabama Maududi in Tafhim al-Quran writes on page 18:32, note number 62. Quote, "The identification of Dhul Qarnayn has been a controversial matter from the earliest times. In general the commentators have been of the opinion that he was Alexander the Great, but the characteristics of Dhul Qarnayn described in the Quran are not applicable to him. However, now the commentators are inclined to believe that Dhul Qarnayn was Cyrus, an ancient king of Iran. We are also of the opinion that probably Dhul Qarnayn was Cyrus, but the historical facts, which have come to light up to this time, are not sufficient to make any categorical assertion." Close quote. You see, now Muslim scholars are left to not know what to do. Let's get to the story of Dhul Qarnayn. There are many issues with the Dhul Qarnayn story. First of all, the story is very similar to the Syriac Alexander romance which was authored in the same era and could easily have come to Arabia. The stories are startlingly similar and have very strong parallels. Point number 1, Alexander the Great goes to the place of sunrise at the edge of the earth and sees a people who have no shade from the sun. When the sun comes up, they run and jump into the water to avoid being burned by the rays of the sun. Point number 2, Alexander the Great goes to the place of sunset at the other edge of the earth and he discovers that the sun goes into the fetid dark murky sea. Point number 3, people complain to Alexander about the tribes of Gog and Magog who are creating havoc for them. Point number 4, Alexander says he will build a dam or gate out of copper and iron, same two metals mentioned in the Quran, to trap them between the two mountains. So now we have a problem. We are faced with two possibilities. Either the Syriac Alexander romance was influenced by the Quran, or the Quran was influenced by the Alexander romance. Which one is it? This is our first doubt. Both of the stories are dated to the same time period, so we cannot rule out either possibility. The version recorded in Syriac is of particular importance because it was current in the Middle East during the time of the Quran's writing and is regarded as being closely related to the literary and linguistic origins of the story of Dhul Qarnayn in the Quran. Secondly, the content itself of the story does not seem to be realistic. How can an entire nation of people be trapped between two mountains? The Alexander romance describes a flat earth surrounded by a murky sea. Also, the sun setting into the sea is a problem unto itself. Historical references to this story indicate it was understood literally in tafsir by scholars of Arabic and Quran. Not to mention the use of the language in describing this event. We know for a fact that Dhul Qarnayn was known to the people at the time, based on the fact that they came to ask Prophet Muhammad about him. For example, Quran chapter 18, verse 83 says, quote, "And they ask you, O Muhammad, about Dhul Qarnayn. Say, I will recite to you about him the report." Close quote. The title the two-horned was at least familiar to the Jews. This is evident from the fact they had instigated the Meccan unbelievers to ask the Prophet about him. One must, therefore, inevitably turn to Jewish literature or oral traditions from the time of Muhammad to find out who this person was or to establish what was the kingdom known as the two-horned. This simple statement really limits the scope of who Dhul Qarnayn might be. In the romance, Alexander the Great travels to the edges of the flat earth, and he finds the place where the sun rises. Where the sun rises, the people have no shade, and they have to hide and run when it comes up. Similar to the version recorded in Syriac romance variant, the Quran says in chapter 18, verse 86, quote, "Until, when he reached the setting of the sun, he found it, as if, setting in a spring of dark mud, and he found near it a people. Allah said, O Dhul Qarnayn, either you punish all them, or else adopt among them a way of goodness. Close quote. In the romance, Alexander the Great also goes to where the sun sets into the fetid sea. They believed that the earth was surrounded by a sea which was fetid, dark, dirty. This fetid sea nobody could approach or could die. Around the sea were mountains. Quran says in chapter 18, verse 86, quote, until, when he came to the rising of the sun, he found it rising on a people for whom we had not made against it any shield. Close quote. The story of trapping Gog and Magog between the mountains makes a lot of sense if you believe the world is flat, and that it is possible to trap Gog and Magog between mountains and the fetid sea. Quran chapter 18, verses 96 through 97, states, quote, bring me sheets of iron, until, when he had leveled all them, between the two mountain walls, he said, blow, with bellows, until when he had made it, like fire, he said, bring me, that I may pour over it molten copper. So Gog and Magog were unable to pass over it, nor were they able to effect in it any penetration. Close quote. Now let's talk about Dhul Qarnayn and finding the gate. It would have been possible to make such claims back in the 7th century, when humanity had not actually traversed the earth and while many nations did not know what lay beyond their borders. Now, it is very difficult. Even though humans have not searched every inch of the earth, we do have a pretty good idea. Why can we not find such a gigantic gate? Some Muslims have theorized that Gog and Magog may be living under the earth according to the hollow earth theory. The idea that there are humans living inside the crust of the earth shows the desperation of Muslims trying to make sense out of a story that makes no sense. We also read that Omar al-Khattab himself tried to find the gate. Muhammad ibn Jarir al-Tabari, Volume 3, pages 235 to 239, states, quote, Omar sent, in 22 AH 643 AD, an expedition to Derbent, Russia. Abdurrahman bin Rabia was appointed as the chief of his vanguard. When Abdurrahman entered Armenia, the ruler Shahbaz surrendered without fighting. Then when Abdurrahman wanted to advance towards Derbent, Shahbaz, ruler of Armenia, informed him that he had already gathered full information about the wall built by Dhul Qarnayn, through a man who could supply all the necessary details. Close quote. Now what are Gog and Magog? Some people say they are the Mongolians or the Huns. Some people say they are another race like humans but unlike humans. The Hadith literature gives some hints that they may be humans, or some sort of human creatures, but that point is not really important to our discussion. They are only mentioned twice in the Quran, once above, and the second time here. Quran chapter 18, verses 99, states, quote, and we will leave them that day surging over each other, and, then, the horn will be blown, and we will assemble them in, one, assembly. Close quote. They are however mentioned in the Hadith literature. Apparently they are still trapped behind this gate and mountain and are trying to scratch their way out of it. So far they have not succeeded. This mentioned in the Hadith Sahih Bukhari 60, 26. Quote, narrated Zainab bint Jahsh, that the Prophet, once came to her in a state of fear and said, none has the right to be worshipped but Allah. Woe unto the Arabs from a danger that has come near. An opening has been made in the wall of Gog and Magog like this, making a circle with his thumb and index finger. Zainab bin Jahsh said, O Allah's messenger, ! Shall we be destroyed even though there are pious persons among us? He said, yes, when the evil person will increase. Close quote. Now let's talk about the Great Dam. This gate or dam must be really enormous, as it's trapping an entire race or civilization or creation of God. Yet nobody has ever seen this gate that has kept these creatures out. In fact, Omar sent an expedition to find this gate as recorded in Ibn Kathir and by the Muslim geographer al-Hama'i, and of course they did not find any giant gate trapping an entire nation between two mountains. Apologists now will claim that the fact we cannot find this gate means it's a secret of the Quran. This is another major problem. Are we to take this story completely on faith? Do we have to believe that God hid this entire nation somewhere out of plain sight? When people mention that we are still finding undiscovered native tribes in the forests, these are small tribes with a handful of people, completely different story from Gog and Magog who will number 999 of 1,000 people on Earth at some point. Of course, the early Makkans didn't buy this, and they didn't see anything miraculous about these stories. This is what they said. And they say, the stories of the ancients he has got them written so these are read out to him morning and evening. Quran 25-5. In conclusion, Alexander the Great and Dhul Qarnayn are one and the same person based on multiple evidences and parallels between the stories. Historical documents have shown that Alexander the Great was not a monotheist and was a pagan worshipper. At the time Alexander was portrayed as many things including a monotheist, which the Quran decided to portray him as. The Quran does not include the historical facts about Alexander, rather includes the mythical version of his story which is based on fantasy rather than truth. If we choose to discount history and instead accept the Quran and ignore the strong connection between Alexander the Great and Dhul Qarnayn, we still have a problem to solve regarding the content of the story not making logical sense. Thus, it appears that the Quran is not the word of God but rather the work of a man in the 7th century.